Imagine that for some reason you were awake in the early morning of April 26, 1986. You see a huge fireball blast into the air and you have no idea what it is. In fact, you weren't sure what it was until days after the initial accident. This was what it was like to be a citizen during the Chernobyl accident. Chernobyl should be of great relevance to all of you sitting in the audience right now. We are all approximately 1 hour and 53 minutes away from a nuclear plant, which could at any time be like Chernobyl. Ever since I was in high school, I've been obsessed with the historical events and had knowledge about Chernobyl. It is this year when I truly became obsessed with the tragic events of that disaster. Ever since my obsession with Chernobyl, I have watched numerous documentaries and read lots of articles about it. There are many events that happened around Chernobyl, and I'm going to focus on what led to the explosion and the days after it, the effects of radiation on people and the environment, and what Chernobyl is like today. I will begin with talking about the events leading up to the nuclear disaster. The first thing we should learn about Chernobyl is how exactly everything happened to cause such a disaster. Just for reference, this is Chernobyl before the disaster. At 1 o'clock a.m., April 25, 1986, the operators working at the nuclear power plant began lowering the power on reactor number 4 in preparation for a safety test. At 1 a.m. the next day, the safety features and emergency systems were turned off. 23 minutes after the systems were shut off, the test began, and they had an unexpected power surge. With this happening, an operator hit the emergency shutdown button, which put control rods into the core. 18 seconds after the emergency shutdown button was pressed, the first explosion happened and was quickly followed by a second explosion. This explosion caused the 1,000-ton roof of the reactor to fly off. After the explosion in the building, smoke and graphite chunks flowed throughout the air and radiation was present everywhere. The Soviet government decided to shut down roads so that citizens could not leave or enter. And the next morning, the rest of the reactors were shut off at the nuclear plant. By 6:35 a.m., all the fires that had taken place because of the explosion had been extinguished except the one in the reactor core. The reactor core burned for days, and the next day, nearly around 10 o'clock, helicopters began dumping things like sand, clay, boron, and dolomite into the core, attempting to slow down the emissions of radioactivity. The Soviet government told no one about the accidents until 36 hours it had happened. With that, they decided to evacuate Pripyat and the surrounding areas. The next day, April 26, the world began learning what had happened in Chernobyl because of the satellites and air monitors in different parts of the world. In the beginning of May, the nuclear cleanup began. One of the things they did during the cleanup was they pumped liquid nitrogen into the reactor in hopes of cooling it down. Not only did they just pour liquid nitrogen under the reactor, they also had to kill animals that had been exposed to radioactivity and bury contaminated topsoil. They also had to get the graphite chunks off the roof. As you can see, these are the 3 different parts of the roof, each with different radioactive emissions. Marcia, which was right above the reactor, was the worst. Katya was to the side of the reactor, wasn't as bad, and then Nina was the least radioactive. On May 6, the emissions dropped, and 3 days later, concrete was laid under the reactor to prevent any more radiation from sinking into the ground. Finally, on May 14th, Gorbachev spoke publicly about Chernobyl and what had happened. According to the official internationally recognized death toll, just 31 people died as an immediate result of Chernobyl. Now that we've focused on the events leading up to Chernobyl, the disaster itself, and the days after, we will look at the effects that radioactivity had on people and the environment. Not only were people affected by the nuclear fallout, but so were animals and the environment. In an article by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, it is said that the total number of thyroid cancer registered in the 1991 to 2015 period among those under 18 years of age and 1986 approached 20,000. 5,000 of these cases were because of radioactive iodine. There's a graph showing thyroid cancer going up. While not everyone was close enough to the initial explosion to be diagnosed with ARS, I'm still going to touch on what it was and how it affected people who were diagnosed. ARS stands for acute radiation sickness. Radiation sickness symptoms can include hair loss, fever, bloody vomit, stools from internal bleeding, and also horrible effects on your skin. I'm going to show you guys a picture of what that looks like. Here's a warning. It's pretty graphic. This was probably a moderate amount of radiation from Chernobyl, and this is a very strong amount of radiation. This was probably the worst you could get with radiation sickness. We can see how bad the radiation affected people by the pictures that you guys just seen and by Valery Legazov, a Soviet chemist who was chief of commission investigating the Chernobyl disaster. In his tapes, he talked about the heartbreaks and struggles of Chernobyl. He later committed suicide. Animals that were contaminated because of the radiation were killed after horrible, and the ones that weren't suffered horrible mutations, just like this horse. The environment was also affected by radiation. Trees wilted and plants suffered mutations, and they were not suitable for anyone to eat. The top layer of soil also had to be buried because of radiation. It is said that Chernobyl will not be habitable again for another 20,000 years. While Chernobyl is not habitable again, many tourists like to go and visit the nuclear plant and take guided tours. There are also many people who live and work around Chernobyl to this day. The reactor that exploded and caused a nuclear accident was covered in 2016 by a steel barrier to cover the decaying sarcophagus. Now that we have learned about the Chernobyl disaster, we should be more informed on the logistics of the disaster. Chernobyl was a nuclear disaster that happened on April 26, 1986, that caused lots of death and disease and had effects on people and the environment. Chernobyl is now a tourist spot, and many people enjoy learning about what happened. So far, none of us in this room have been personally affected by a nuclear disaster, and we need to cross our fingers that we aren't.